I first just wanted to say thank you to Jose and Susan for inviting me, letting me come and speak today. At the time of the original conference, I was working on an MPhil on new comedy. By the time the book came out, I was working on a PhD on Helen of Troy. But in the intervening years, I've since left academia and become a professional librarian. So if I'm slightly rusty, please bear with me. Oh, good. Okay, the predominantly male construction of Helen as a symbol of womanhood in Greek ideology demonstrates the ambiguity men feel about female desire and sexuality. Within myths, this ambiguity potentially led to rape and sexual violence. In the Iliad, when Helen speaks to Priam on the city wall, she castigates herself for coming to Troy and leaving behind her family and home. She gives no indication that she was taken by force, rather that she had some choice in the matter, albeit with divine odds stacked heavily against her. Paris's view of events, however, is portrayed as somewhat different from Helen's. While she apparently believes that she had a choice, Paris describes the event not in terms of persuasion and seduction, but of snatching or stealing, harpazo. The action of Helen's transference from Greece to Troy is therefore portrayed differently by the male and female participants. This paper looks at two pivotal points in Helen's mythical life that include potential sexual violence, her abduction by Paris and the reclamation by Menelaus. I will explore the reception of these themes primarily through comics and graphic novels, but with references to vase paintings to demonstrate some differences and similarities in the visual portrayals of Helen. The Trojan cycle and other Greek myths have been represented in illustrated and comic book form for at least 70 years since the Gilbert and Company's Classics Illustrated produced the Iliad in 1950 and the Odyssey in 1951. There have been a variety of other examples since that time, with target audiences ranging from school-aged children to adults. Prevalent is an overarching pedagogical aspect to much of this material, whether they are exhorting readers to turn to the originals or being created as teaching tools themselves. Many of the texts I mention are adaptations of the Iliad or the Odyssey, neither of which directly feature Helen's abduction or reclamation. However, several examples do try to frame the story of the Iliad with contextual elements, describing how the war came about and how it was ended, and it is within these extras that we find the evidence that we're looking for. In Greek art, the term the persuasion Helen was first appropriated by Gali Carhill in 1955. The paintings demonstrate that these artists at least clearly recognise as crucial the moment of persuasion or seduction that convinced Helen to go to Troy. Once Helen has been persuaded or not, she leaves Sparta with Paris, and this is depicted in a number of ways. From the first quarter of the 5th century, we have two examples of Helen being abducted on foot by Paris, an Attic skiphos and cup, both by Macron. In both cases, Paris is shown leading Helen by the wrist, kai epikarpoi, and she seems to accompany him with little resistance. This gesture is seen to indicate possession and appears in scenes of abductions and also forms part of wedding iconography. Indeed, on the Boston skiphos, the scene is akin to a wedding procession. Paris and Helen maintain eye contact, while Eros adjusts Helen's Stephan, and Aphrodite acts as an amphitryon and attends to her veil. Although this is an active scene, there is no violence depicted in the abduction. The use of wedding iconography in a non-traditional, non-wedding scene is not unusual within Greek art, and adds more than one layer of meaning to the picture we're viewing. This scene may be read as Paris abducting Helen, but shows her compliance in this act. In addition, there is mythological legitimation of Paris's action, as the scene records a wedding procession, and thus it can also be read as the wedding procession of Paris and Helen. Thus, we are not only witnessing an abduction, but a wedding too, or the future promise of a wedding. This kind of wedding iconography, combined with the presence of Papho, offers sanction and respectability to the union of Paris and Helen. The utilisation of wedding images in these non-wedding scenes of Helen legitimises her as a bride or potential wife-to-be. This compliant form of abduction, akin to a marriage procession, appears fairly rarely, but there are also scenes of abduction by chariots. Chariots are often associated with weddings, and on vase paintings they are the normal form of transport for the wedding couple. This then lends another level of meaning to the abduction so depicted. For example, on an Apollon the Kethos, Eros stands in the chariot with the reins in his hand. This is not a quick getaway, but an assumed successful venture. A female standing in front of the chariot may be Aphrodite. If so, we can see the divine presence conveying the legitimacy of the abduction. Paris has picked up Helen and is carrying her to the chariot. Her left arm is raised in a veiling gesture, while her right arm reaches out behind him, either as an appeal for help to the figure behind them, or gesture of resignation. There is little that Helen can do. The carrying away of a victim such as Helen by means of a chariot was, according to Cohen in 96, a codification of rape in the pictorial tradition. She goes on to note that no artist challenged the basic structure of the chariot scheme. All artists euphemistically envisioned rape as abduction. No artist ventured to visualise what happened after the chariot disappeared from view. We've thus seen in the iconographic tradition persuasion, abduction on foot, and abduction by chariot, with elements of wedding imagery referenced. In the pictorial imagery of comics, we'll also, I believe, see some referencing to wedding imagery and acknowledgements of Greek vase paintings. The majority of examples I'm going to discuss view Paris' abduction of Helen as a seduction, but I do have one where Helen is taken without her consent. The Classics Illustrated Iliad was published in 1950 and reissued in 1968 with a different cover. As is common with adaptations of the Iliad, there is a small prequel section which puts the story into perspective. In this version, Paris is shown to abduct Helen. He is described as crazed with love for her, but although the gods are depicted throughout the story, curiously Aphrodite is not blamed for Paris' actions here. The image shows Paris carrying a very passive-looking Helen out of Sparta, after she had been depicted being happily married to Menelaus. There is a similar image on the frontispiece, where Helen looks just as passive, almost asleep. Helen is the victim, and although there is no explicit violence, the fact that she's been carried off without her consent, possibly while she's unconscious, brings with it all the implications of sexual violence or rape to come. Aside from the gods, there is very little representation of women in this version of the Iliad. We do not see Helen again, nor do we meet Andromache, and Hecuba appears only once to beg Hector to stay within the walls of Troy. Where we did see Helen at the very beginning, she was portrayed as a very passive character, and depicted for the most part with her eyes downcast in the role of submissive wife. This version is also one of the very few instances where Helen is illustrated with a chariot. In this case, not however part of Paris' abduction, but as an indicator of her happy marriage to Menelaus. The artist has, however unconsciously, associated the chariot as a positive indicator of marriage, much as it was used as part of wedding iconography on Greek vases. The image of Helen being bodily carried is, once again, utilised in the Marvel Illustrated Iliad that was published in 2009, first in 8 individual comics and then brought together as a paperback book. It was part of a trilogy of comics from the Marvel in their Marvel Illustrated series, which began in 2007, with the aim to adapt classic literature, much as they had done in the 1970s. Thus we have the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Trojan War, all written by Roy Thomas. The third volume written as such to fill in the gaps, and based on works from the epic cycle, plays by Euripides, and the Fall of Troy by Quintus of Smyrna. This trilogy is aimed at an adult audience and comes with a parental advisory label, and is not envisaged to be used as a pedagogical text. The Iliad includes a prologue featuring Helen, the contest of the suitors, and the arrival of Paris. As Aphrodite has promised Helen to Paris, they are brought together and sail away from Sparta. The image of Paris carrying Helen onto a ship is very reminiscent of the image we saw from the 1950s classic illustrated comic. Paris carries Helen. She is passive in his arms. But in this version, we know she is acquiescing to the abduction, and she is welcomed as bride in Troy. What signified rape and abduction in the 1950s image now signifies persuasion and love, but also signifies possession, as it did in the 1950s. In this 2009 image, their heads are close together, unlike the 1950s image where Helen flops passively in Paris' arms. Paris is also depicted carrying Helen onto the ship, over a threshold, akin to the tradition of carrying a bride over the threshold into a house. There are several theories about the origin of this tradition, but at least one does link it to abduction or kidnap-style marriages, so an unwilling bride is carried into the home. Thus, we can read the image as showing both a willing Helen, but also alluding to the idea that she's an abducted Helen and stolen goods. As Paris carries Helen, so do his men carry treasure chests. In the Trojan War, published in 2010, first in 5 issues and then brought together into the paperback, the storyline surrounding the Trojan War is expanded. Thus, the background to the war is given, and events leading up to the Iliad are detailed, starting with Zeus's desire to reduce the population on Earth. Helen's seduction by Paris is swift and consummated when Menelaus sails away to Crete. Helen and Paris' relationship is depicted as mutual, even more so than in the 2009 Iliad, and we see them standing together on the ship rather than seeing Helen carried on board. Even though the text at this point is practically the same, the equation of Helen to the stolen treasure is no longer explicit. Instead, she is portrayed as an equal partner to Paris. This trilogy was not the first time that Marvel had adapted the Iliad and Odyssey into comic book form. In 1977, Marvel Classic Comics produced single issues, which look much more like contemporary comics in an attempt to appeal to the normal Marvel demographic, rather than extorting readers to go and read the originals, as the classics illustrated from the 1950s had done. The story leaps right into the Iliad without a dramatisation of events that led up to this point, but there are a couple of flashback interjections. We're first introduced to Helen within the walls of Troy as Paris parades his prize around town. The guards on the walls, who are supposed to be watching the Greek forces amass for battle, are drawn to her beauty. As their eyes turn to her, so does the reader, who is informed that this woman is Helen of Troy, whose face launched 1,000 ships, wife to the Prince of Achaea, lover to the Prince of Troy. First impressions are given of a sexy adulteress who shows little shame at her actions. She wears a pink dress, which is significant in the light of other adaptations where she's dressed in white and given an air of respectability. 1970s Helen is all about sex and not about respectability. However, once we have been introduced to Helen on this page, we receive a flashback to show how the war came about, starting with the judgment of Paris. This notes the intervention of Aphrodite, who offers Helen to Paris. He knows she is married to Menelaus, but since it is a goddess offering him another man to wife, he has no complaints. The final panel states that the goddess of love guided Paris' abduction of Helen, and a spell caused the woman to love her new prince. Although we're not shown the abduction, this panel is one of the fleet sailing to Troy to retrieve Helen, so the imagery alluding to the idea that Helen's abduction was by ship. There are two views of Helen on this page, as the reader is guided to see Helen as a sexy adulteress, even though we are told that it's only by Aphrodite's magic that she falls in love with Paris. We next see Helen reclined on a bed when Aphrodite has whisked Paris from the battlefield before Menelaus can kill him. Although she blames Aphrodite for bringing them together in the bedroom, she has a smile on her face. As Paris is taken from the battlefield, it is emphasised that Helen rejected Menelaus for Paris. Although Aphrodite is clearly apportioned blame for the bringing together of Helen and Paris, both initially and here during the battle, there are mixed messages about Helen's choices. Where Greek vases tended to show an abduction either on foot or by chariot, comics tend to focus on Helen and Paris' departure by ship. We've already seen this illustrated, and the next couple of examples will only add to the motif. There are a couple of examples from the ancient world of Helen's abduction by ship, but they tend to be of a later date or within certain identification. The graphics version of the Odyssey, published in 2009, and which, like some versions of the Iliad, has a prequel section to set the book in context, includes a background on the Trojan War, which shows how Aphrodite engineers the love between Helen and Paris. Once again, they are depicted on a ship, running away to Troy, and imbuing one another with immortal attributes. However, later on we have given a panel showing that Aphrodite has to continue to weave magic spells to keep Paris in love with Helen, demonstrating that theirs is not a natural relationship, and without Aphrodite's interference, nothing would have happened between them. There's no mention of Helen needing spells, but once taken to Troy, she would have had little chance of escape. In the notes at the back of the book, it is stated that Helen of Troy is still famous for her beauty and foolishness. This seems an overly harsh critique of Helen, when in this adaptation itself it is demonstrated that her actions are because of Aphrodite. By informing readers that Helen is foolish, the complexity of events are diminished, and as a woman she is blamed for Paris' actions as much as her own. Our next example is The Trojan Horse, The Fall of Troy, published by Lerner Books in 2010. The Trojan Horse had taken a specific part of the Trojan myth that isn't in the Iliad. Instead, they acknowledge that this episode is adapted from Virgil's Aeneid and the War of Troy by Quintus of Smyrna. Helen is a major part of the story that frames the episode, but we also encounter the gods and the story of the Golden Apple. Helen is promised to Paris by Aphrodite, and it's Aphrodite who persuades Helen to leave Menelaus. Helen is depicted in a long white gown with a veil pinned to the back of her head, although this is also what she's wearing when Paris meets her as Menelaus' wife, and the Queen of Sparta. The imagery is very reminiscent of modern-day brides. Helen is the only woman in this book who is shown wearing a veil, although it does not cover her face. Her bridal imagery lends an air of respectability to when she's shown running off with Paris and when she arrives in Troy and is introduced to the royal family. As the war progresses, she is still depicted wearing the veil. It acts as a signifier to her respectability, but also to her otherness in comparison to the Trojan women who she is surrounded with. It is telling that at the end of the war she no longer has the veil, and I'll discuss the significance of this later. The final group of graphic novels that I wish to look at regarding Helen's abduction is Eric Shanower's Age of Bronze series. There are 7 projected volumes, but so far the project is only half complete, which means that we're nowhere near Menelaus' reclamation of Helen, but we do have the persuasion of Helen by Paris. The sequence of pages and panels manages to juxtapose scenes of Helen's turmoil at her unexpected passion for Paris. The influence, although not the direct involvement of Aphrodite, the judgment of Paris, which is perceived of as a dream, and the counsel of Aethra, who reminds Helen of when she was carried off by Theseus. Helen is in turmoil, and it is demonstrated that this is not an easy decision to make. She also faces the heartbreak of leaving Hermione behind to ensure that Menelaus still has a claim to the Spartan throne. In other simpler versions, Helen has been shown slipping away in the night, either with or without her consent. Shanower's version illustrates the leave-taking as much messier. Initially, we see Helen and Paris hastening to meet each other in a dark grove. The atmosphere is romantic. But this quickly turns to chaos as the Trojans raid the palace and steal valuables. While no one is killed, there is violence and unpleasantness. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit since I'm running out of time. Helen is demonstrated to be experiencing a lot of inner conflict. And Shannon has made these events all about Paris, his lusts and desires both for Helen and for acceptance of the Trojan court. He is young and foolish, and he's not the only one who pays price for inappropriate lust. Shannon has decided to denote Helen and Paris' relationship as one driven by sexual desire, but in contrast, he does illustrate the rape of Didomea by Achilles when he's disguised as a girl in the owl and the Skyros. The rape takes place during sacred womanly rites, portrayed as bacchanalic in style. Achilles, in the guise of Pyrrha, leads Didomea away from the others. He's confused about feelings for her, and thinking she has realised he's male, begins to kiss her. He swiftly pushes her to the ground, and taking advantage of her confusion and innocence, rapes her. The depiction of the rape is not graphic as such, although we are under no illusion to what is going on. Once the sex is over, Didomea lies curled on the ground in tears. We're also under no illusion to the outcome of the rape, as on the facing page it is 9 months later and Didomea is giving birth. She has accepted Achilles as her secret lover and is ready to play happy families, whereas Achilles is portrayed as feeling trapped in the situation he got himself into. The juxtaposition of the rape scene and the birth scene opposite highlight cause and effect, and both scenes are accompanied by a variety of screams, shouts and wails. The hollers and whoops of the sacred rites, alongside Didomea's screams of pain and fear, which are then matched to her screams and pants during childbirth and the wail of her child. Is it coincidence that the first volume of the Age of Wands contains both the persuasion of Helen and the rape of Didomea? We see the results of young men acting on their lusts and the potential consequences. 2 women whose lives are turned upside down. Helen's story so could easily be one of rape and abduction. Many of the depictions of Helen on vase paintings come within the abduction genre, thus making it unclear whether rape was being portrayed through metaphor or not. There are, however, some illustrations that portray her in a more violent situation. And the protagonist in these pictures is neither Theseus nor Paris, but none other than her husband Menelaus. When Troy fell to the Greeks, Helen was reunited with Menelaus and, according to Homer, returned to Sparta. Although their first meeting is not described by Homer, a selection of other texts demonstrate how the power of desire affected Menelaus, such as Leshy's Little Iliad, Aristophanes' Lysistrata, and Euripides' Andromache. And they note how when Menelaus saw her breasts, he cast away his sword. All these incidents seem to illustrate the power of the gaze upon Helen. This is aptly demonstrated on vase paintings where Menelaus is shown charging at Helen with a sword, presumably intent on killing her. Desire for Helen, however, appears to stop Menelaus in his tracks. Some of these paintings show Menelaus dropping his sword as he makes eye contact with Helen, and thus ably demonstrates the link between the gaze and desire, erotically charged eye contact overcoming the desire for violence. There are also paintings that depict Helen seeking refuge while Menelaus seizes her. These illustrations are more demonstrably violent than some of the almost humorous versions in which Menelaus casts away his sword. They also share iconographic motifs with Ajax's rape of Cassandra. These vase paintings show Helen seeking sanctuary by reaching out to a cult statue, and in one instance to the goddess Aphrodite. Menelaus is depicted grabbing her hair and dragging her back off the statue. And the cult statues represent a variety of deities, including Aphrodite, Athena, and Apollo. On a grand volute crater, Athena is the deity to whom Helen runs, and we should remember that it was the statue of Athena to which Cassandra clung before being raped by Ajax. Although the artist chose different deities for Helen to run to, by assuming the motif or iconography of Cassandra's rape, they are making an explicit comparison. And on the same plot, we see Cassandra seeking refuge there too. By returning to the modern text, in The Trojan Horse, the last pages in the book illustrate moments from the sack of Troy in 5 panels. We see women captured as slaves, women and children in general, and more specifically Cassandra and Helen. One woman claims, better a slave than dead, echoing Achilles' claim from the underworld in the Odyssey, whilst her companion questions that statement. For an adult reader, we are aware of what fates a female slave is liable to suffer, so that the idea of rape and abuse is hinted at. As Cassandra is captured, we see that she is aware of her fate to come, and we know that in mythology she is raped at the point of capture. Her captor stands over her as Cassandra is on her knees in a submissive position. He leers and calls her a pretty princess and a prize. She's an object that he can do what he wants to. In the final panel, we have Menelaus finding Helen. He has his sword raised and is about to kill her as she sits prone at the base of a column. Both Cassandra and Helen are pictured next to columns, which can be read as signifiers for the shrines they're usually said to be captured in. In contrast to Cassandra, who's depicted in her royal robe, the outfit she's been drawn in throughout the book, Helen is wearing a white dress akin to the bridal gown she first appeared in Troy in. But it's been torn and ripped. It is now sleeveless and rises above her knees instead of floor length. And significantly, she no longer has her veil. Her appearance is far more dishevelled than any of the other women on this page, an outfit now revealing, positing that her sexual morals are looser than those of the women of Troy. Although they've been captured as slaves, they retain their moral dignity, whereas Helen is the woman to blame and is shown carrying on the floor, barefoot. Her otherness, earlier demarked by the veil which gave her respectability, is now emphasised by her disarray. At the end of the page, we are left uncertain whether Helen will live, and it is only over the page that we found out her fate. This next page is all about Helen and Menelaus, and even with her dishevelled and pitiable state, It is not so much Helen's beauty that stopped Menelaus in his tracks, but it's rather Agamemnon who prevents him from killing her. Although sexual violence isn't illustrated due to the juvenile audience, it is indeed implicit in the capture of the women, and Helen is actually threatened with physical violence and death. We are also reminded that this is all because of her unfaithfulness, and blame is therefore laid at her feet. My final example returns to the Marvel Trojan War published in 2010. As the book is depicting events outside the Iliad, we therefore get to see the reclamation of Helen by Menelaus in detail. And here, as in the Trojan horse example just discussed, it is portrayed as a violent scene. Menelaus finds Helen and Deiphobus in their bedchamber and kills Deiphobus by running a sword through him. He's about to do the same to Helen when she stands up naked before him, offering him the opportunity to kill her, if that's what he really wants to do, with the obvious implication that there are other things he could be doing to her. To the side of Helen stands a statue of Apollo, the naked male statue contrasting to Helen's nudity. As mentioned earlier, the idea of Helen seeking sanctuary as a statue of Apollo was utilised by at least one Greek vase painter. Thus, just as on vase paintings we looked at earlier, when Menelaus is faced with the naked beauty of Helen, he's stopped in his tracks. A desire to kill turns into desire to possess her once again. The bottom panel of this page is Menelaus leading Helen by the wrist through Troy, a signifier that we've seen associated with the wedding imagery on Greek vases, and which is used in some reclamation paintings, though generally with a meeting of the gaze between Helen and Menelaus, indicating that their reunion is mutual. In this example, Menelaus has reclaimed Helen, but for now she is his prisoner, hence the hold by the wrist, which doesn't hold the same connotations in modern society, although the artist may be alluding to its use on Greek vases, as we know that by the time they reach Sparta, she will be his wife again. I've looked at both graphic novels and Greek vase paintings, and although they can't be directly compared as they do from different cultures and time periods, I do believe that there is a relevance in looking at the modern interpretations in the light of certain patterns and motifs utilised in the ancient world. Many of them do pay direct or indirect homage to Greek vase paintings, and some openly reference these images as inspiration. Shanaway, the artist who has probably undertaken the most detailed research, acknowledges some of his inspiration in his graphic essay 21st Troy, within the Classics and Comics edited volume. He demonstrates that the face of Helen came from the Peplos Kore, a statue from 530 BC, whilst an image of Achilles and Patroclus came from an Attic regged figure cup, although he changed the style of the armour. There are more contemporary motifs that can be identified that tap into ideological aspects of the time period they are produced in. So in the 1950s, we have very passive portrayals of Helen and other women, and they are very much incidental to the stories told. In the 1970s, Helen is a sex object, and plays into the increasing sexualisation of women in comic form that become over the top in the 1980s and 90s. By 2010, Helen and other women portrayed are much more autonomous. This is a generalisation, and there are more subtleties involved, but it is a general pattern that fits with other comic book representations of women. I end with one final example, demonstrating that writers and artists in the 21st century are now imbuing their creations with voices that were previously unheard. Odysseus the Rebel, published in 2009, shows an exchange between Telemachus and one of Penelope's maids, Thyano, which reveals an aspect about the treatment of women, both slave and non-slave, not previously expressed. Thyano claims that women, especially the lowborn, don't have a choice when highborn men desire sex with them. They either acquiesce or they face the possibility of rape and murder. When she insinuates that Penelope herself may have given in to the suitors, Telemachus is enraged and draws a dagger upon her. In a scene very reminiscent of Menelaus' reclamation of Helen, Thyano bares her breast, ostensibly to offer easy access for Telemachus to stab her heart. But the sight of her naked breast unsettles Telemachus, and he's unable to kill her, much as Menelaus couldn't kill Helen. On the following page, the names of Helen and Menelaus are even invoked, as Thyano highlights how women are treated as property. This 21st century voice helps to demonstrate that over 70 years, ideological changes have occurred, particularly in the portrayal of women, sex and violence. The visual depictions are far more sexualised than they were in the 1950s, although, with some adult exceptions aside, such as the heavy metal comics versions of the Odyssey, the Trojan War mythic retellings have avoided using the extremely provocative poses that are anatomically impossible, that became common in mainstream comics. However, in the 21st century, greater emphasis is given to what women have to say. Some early versions of the Iliad and Odyssey, and condensing the stories to comic book format, remove female characters from the narrative to a great extent, and concentrated on the action, aiming their product at a male adolescent audience. This is now being addressed as some authors and artists are breaking away from the traditional formulaic patterns to appeal to a far wider demographic. In doing so, they are giving women back their voices.